and we'll have a meaningful dialogue. Here we go. Charles Hoskinson, are you watching what David Sinclair is exploring? How about Aubrey de Grey and the Sense Foundation? So David is like the new Aubrey. So years ago, when I was reading about this stuff, Aubrey was the guy, and he wrote books back in like 2007, 2008. And his whole argument was that maintenance could find a way to restore something or slow something down to a point where you could live a lot longer. And he identified different categories of what happens as you age, the breakdown of each of those categories. And so he published the book, and there was a little controversy, and he challenged his critics, and very proper academic dialogue, and they kind of fought each other into a stalemate. And what he did is he made this claim that if he set up a foundation and he had like $100 million or something like that, he'd have sufficient funding to be able to get to kind of a longevity escape velocity. And the idea there is that for every year you age, they extend your lifespan by a year. So, essence, barring accident, you actually never die. Aubrey has at times been a controversial figure, but he kind of started a really nice conversation. And in the academic circles at the time he started it, it wasn't considered to be a super interesting. It was kind of like AI has AGI and math has things like the Millennium Problems. They're super hard. They exist. People are aware of them. But people don't actually work on them because it doesn't really do much for your career. Well, anti-aging was the same to biology for a lot of people. It wasn't something that was sexy or vogue to study. You could do it in very simple organisms, but when you actually move to complex organisms, people say, well, it's too big of a problem. You're not going to solve anything. David Sinclair, on the other hand, did make a career out of doing that. I believe he's at Harvard, and he's written a few books. Lifespan is the one that people know him for. And David has a big anti-aging lab, and he's been involved in most of the big innovations that have occurred, like the statement that resveratrol may have an impact on aging, and namely that if you take it, it actually slows it down. Although there's bioavailability problems in practice and other concerns there. But also, I think he was connected to the NAD studies, and he's got all these mice that he plays around with, and he tries to tinker with their internal clocks. And recently, he's created a podcast where he goes over many of the things he discussed in Lifespan, in addition to the things he's learned since. So he's a really interesting fellow, very well published, very credible, and there's certainly a lot of interesting things there. In general, the two biggest things you can do to expand your lifespan have nothing to do with emerging science. They're good old-fashioned diet and exercise, which is something I need to do. Usually when they talk about anti-aging, they say, in addition to the optimal, meaning there already is an assumption that you're eating the things you should eat and you're working out the way you should work out. And this is plus plus. So people have been exploring things like the use of rhabdomyosin and metformin. And metformin in particular looks very promising. And David does mention that, I believe, in his book. So a real good guy to talk to. What is the status of sidechains to build cross-chain dApps? Are really missing out massive dApp ecosystem. Well, Milkamada is about, and there's also Mamba project, and we should be able to make a meaningful update on Mamba at the end of the month. The last information I got, which was February, so I haven't checked up on that team in about 2 weeks, is that they were still slated for some form of a testnet here this month. So I will get back to you guys on that. For those of you who don't know, Mamba is a BFT Ethereum sidechain for Cardano. How we started is a testnet disconnected, similar to Catalyst being disconnected. Build up an ecosystem there, test the ERC20 converter, get great benchmarks, optimize, get good code quality, and then it's part of a broader sidechains agenda. Now, Cardano sidechains are really interesting, and the reason being is that it actually has a monetary incentive for ADA holders when a sidechain is released on Cardano. So how we're thinking about making it work is that you have Cardano, the main network, and that's powered by Ouroboros. And you have a bunch of stake pool operators that run the system authorized by the delegators. And that's a large set. That's that K factor. So as K increases over time, as ADA gets larger, then you get more and more members of that set. Then, because that set exists and it's a secure root of trust, what you can do is sortition the set and use it to bootstrap a fast BFT protocol. And we have that protocol. It's called Ouroboros BFT. It's really cool. It's very simple. It's very lightweight. But then you can run a sidechain. It has the same security dynamics as the base layer, but you have fast finality and you have high throughput with that system. Now, if you have tokens in that system and it's bootstrapped, then those rewards for making those blocks also get paid to the stake pool operator. So let's say you have an ecosystem with 50 sidechains and 50 tokens and the main chain, then the stake pools would actually make 50 tokens plus ADA when they make blocks, assuming that they've been selected to participate in each of those quorums. So the more sidechains, the merrier for these types of things. As for TVL and these other things, I mean, it's early days. We've gone from 2 to over 250 million, and the majority of dApps seem to be backloaded towards the Vasil Hardfork because they want to benefit from pipelining as well as the expressivity increases and expressiveness increases in Plutus. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But again, those growth metrics are looking phenomenal. There's a spool up time when you create these things, and we're getting there. Is Vasil short for Vaseline because it will make everything smoother? No, it's short for Vasil Dobov, who was a really good fan of the Cardano ecosystem, a great human being, and an old friend of mine who perished last year. And so we wanted to honor him by naming one of the hard forks after him. Charles, what do you think about the EU possibly banning proof of work? Will Bitcoin and Ethereum take a hit? I mean, there's been certainly some conversations about it. It's puzzling to me because people in the proof of work world live in this bizarre reality where all the energy spent on Bitcoin doesn't seem to exist. It's as if we have unlimited energy and this is the best possible use case of it. They don't acknowledge that there's a high energy consumption. It's there, you acknowledge it. Now, they seem to conflate the idea that this is, in their view, useful or productive use of energy with the concept that we are at an energy deficit in the world. And what we're doing is we're taking the battery that millions, if not billions of years of vegetation gave us from fossil fuels, and we're rapidly expending that battery to power the entire world. We don't have a sustainable power grid. So we're running an energy deficit for production relative to consumption when you look at renewable to non-renewable sources. And part of that deficit now is the Bitcoin network. And so a lot of policymakers are saying, well, first we need to rebalance these things and make more or equivalent to what we spend. So we have a surplus or neutrality. So some form of renewable energy source. Okay, and energy enters the system all the time. It's called the sun. And at the same time, we also need to conserve large energy expenditures. So people go, for example, to the concrete business, and because it's a huge consumer of electricity, or the metallurgy people, so the steel people, these types of things. They say, you guys consume aluminum, same, huge amounts of electricity, massive amounts of power to do what you do from the whole cycle of the supply chain. We need to find a way to reduce that and make what you do more environmentally friendly. So that's what regulators do to industries. So then you look at the blockchain business and you see Bitcoin and Ethereum and Cardano and Solana and all these other things, and they do some things. And then there's a question of efficiency behind the things that they do. The problem with maximalism is what they do is they say it is incomparable what they do. So even though Cardano and Bitcoin are both UTXO-based systems, both have deflationary monetary policies, both process transactions and move value, both use cryptography, and both are functionally cryptocurrencies, what the Bitcoin people do is say proof of stake simply does not work. Everything on Cardano is an elaborate proof of perpetual motion scam, and it's a plutocracy controlled by central bankers or whatever the latest argument is. In other words, we're not legitimate. We don't exist. We should be ignored. And now, if that argument doesn't stand, then they run into a very inconvenient truth. You have system A that uses more power than Ecuador, and system B that uses the power of a warehouse, and one is better, faster, and cheaper, mine. So that's a problem. Okay. So this is one of those uncomfortable conversations with the European Union while they talk about proof of work. And they say, okay, well, if you have two industries within an industry, if you have two approaches and one is massively more energy efficient than the other, the one that's not has to justify itself in some way. So what is it? Is it more security? Well, that's debatable because all these papers have been written and these systems are running and they've never been hacked for years with plenty of people trying to do that. Is it in some way more efficiency, or it's more egalitarian, or it's more decentralized, whatever that means? But we have no index for decentralization. So I think it's premature and bad for the EU to ban proof of work, but it does bring in an interesting conversation, which is the European Union, by just asking the question, forces many inconvenient, uncomfortable conversations to come into play. What if a usable proof of work exists? We've written a paper for that. So does that matter? Maybe we have to move from useless to useful. Would it being a distributed computer actually, instead of just a Rube Goldberg machine that wastes electricity, would that make people feel better? So I don't think Bitcoin Ethereum will take a hit at all. I think that just like China banning Bitcoin really didn't do anything to the ecosystem. But I do think it is a wake-up call for the astute listener to really start talking about comparability within industry. Because if you use analogy, if I have two ways of making concrete, and one way involves burning all the forests down, and the other way is sustainable and uses sunlight, and I can do it forever and not destroy the environment, I mean, which one would you pick? And if the people who say burning all the forests down, it somehow keeps the evil spirits away, whereas the sunlight attracts them, or it's a scam. It's like you have the same piles of concrete on both sides. The burden eventually follows on them. And actually, the Ethereum crowd admits this, which is why they're moving to a proof of stake based system. And it's my belief that over time, the majority of value in the cryptocurrency space will actually be protected by proof of stake style systems as opposed to proof of work style systems. And they say, well, that's equivalent to central banking and it's an oligarchy. No, it's not a plutocracy or oligarchy. Central bank system, I can't go to an exchange and buy part of the Federal Reserve and have a say in the governance of the Federal Reserve. At any given time, for any proof of stake coin with liquidity, I'm always able to acquire some of that power of the system and have a say over its governance. And ASICs are not necessarily a fair game. What if the primary ASIC supply chain is patented and private? You're not allowed by law to replicate what they've done. You'll have to spend millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions to replicate what they've done. And they have first access to it. Is that an egalitarian democratic system? It used to be different. When I first joined Bitcoin back in the day, we could mine on its CPUs. So this computer right here, or GPUs. And I even did. I had a Crossfire 45850 AMD cards. I was running 1.2 gigahashes. It's great times. So it was very egalitarian back then. But now, not as much. It's a little harder to get your hands on these things reliably, especially during a chip shortage. It tends to stay in certain areas, certain friends and family. Not to say it won't get better, but it just gives you a sense of the nuances of these things. And by the way, Cardano is not mine. I know people are going to take that quote out of context. It's the communities, obviously, and so forth. But we just live in an age where people do that. And this is just an example of people. So how many more years are you going to drag on with your vaporware project, publishing more and more useless papers before you go to prison? 7-day wait time for your DEX, by the way. These are the people. This is our space. Charles, any take on Pfizer CEO's 4 or 5 vaccines before fully vaccinated? I'm no longer considered vaccinated. I have 2 Pfizer shots. I've gotten COVID twice. You'd think that I'm no longer a vector, but apparently, according to Pfizer CEO, I'm unvaccinated and a threat and dangerous. Every time they inject somebody, they make $35. It's pretty fucking sad. I have noticed, though, that the minute that I started saying, hey, we should change the way we do things with COVID, the level of personal attacks has really gone up. Yeah, maybe it's a false correlation, but it seems to be a universal for everybody. Joe Rogan, others. Just a side note, who knows? Strange days. Mm-hmm. Charles, why is Hedera so much better? Did you read their white paper? No, I haven't had a chance to read the white paper yet, but I'm curious to know, why do you feel it's so much better? What's the reason? What compels you to say that? Just tell everybody. Charles, what do you think of the current congestion status on Cardano? Do you believe right now the parameters are adjusted so that it can smoothly run into the next scalability update? Well, there'll be more parameter updates. And the next update, the hard fork that's coming in June will be very significant. A big performance improvement, like within an order of magnitude. And I think that will significantly scale up the network to a point where we can handle a lot of load. It's actually fortuitous that Cardano is running at such large capacity. It's giving us a really good sense of what Cardano can do in practice. So when we built Cardano, there were a lot of simulations that were done and deep conversations about basically the capabilities of Cardano to perform well under high load, adversarial load, asymmetries, asymmetrical attacks, these types of things. And in the lab, we believed that the design was great. And now we're actually seeing those scenarios occur. DDoS attacks, high load, big saturation in the mempool, these types of things. And so far, Cardano is behaving exactly as we expected, which is just great. And as we roll out pipelining and other updates, it's only going to get better. So I think that we'll be fine. In fact, there was a big spike, and now things are smoothing out a little bit, and there'll be more parameter updates to come. And then we'll kind of cruise towards June, and that will really improve the state of affairs. And it's a 1-2 punch: pipelining and then input endorsers. So enormous amount of work is happening at the moment for input endorsers, and that will eventually aggregate to a paper that is published called Ouroboros Leos. And there's a blog post on the way, so we should be able to get that out soon. And that blog post will kind of cover the high level design and really give people a sense of why it's so special. What's unique about input endorsers is that it moves us to a situation where the bottleneck of the system is no longer the consensus mechanics, but rather the network stack. So it can scale to the demand, and it really becomes like these DAG style protocols that have super high throughput. So as bandwidth improves over time, the network organically gets faster. So I think those two things together will give us a lot of headroom and then just more optimal use of the extended UTXO market. And there has to be some updates on the economics of the system, which is why we wrote the Babel fees blog post and these other things to kind of give a sense of what needs to be done. Charles, would you ever consider writing a book, and what would it involve? I've thought about writing a few books, so I really do want to write a book on governance, and that's the first kind of in the queue. And then at some point when I retire, I'd like to write memoirs of all the things I've seen and done, and go through all of that. I never particularly thought that I, as a person, was so incredibly interesting. I just build stuff and I enjoy people, and that's great. But apparently, there's Charles the persona and there's Charles the person, and it's a very strange thing. Everybody in the blockchain space at the moment seems to have an opinion on me, one way or the other, negative or positive, and they just feel very comfortable sharing that opinion, in some cases beyond the bounds of decency, and publishing things and so forth. And that's fine. But at the end of the day, does that in any meaningful way actually change the things that I've built? It's all out there. The critics of me, they seem to conveniently forget Cardano and IO and like the last 6 years of my life and all the places I've done and been. And it's just bizarre. It's as if it's like 2014 or something like that. Okay. And it's deeply frustrating at times. It's just it's crazy, to have such a gap between how you perceive yourself to be and how you perceive that you treat others, and then the common notions in certain circles. And a lot of people have reached out to me and told me, "Hey, don't let it bother you. The work continues. Just keep moving forward." And there's a lot of truth in that advice. But every human has built in this need for justice, or this need for vindication, or this "I have to tell you what the real story is." But the reality is that the attacks and the misrepresentations, they're against a person who doesn't exist. They're a collective construction of the criticism, ideas, and hopes, dreams, whatever, of a group of people. And so go attack that person. And once you realize it's a different person, it really just rolls right off of you. You don't really think too much about it. I only let it bother me when actually it seems to hurt the commercialization of the projects I work on or the people that I work with. And some of them are deeply frustrated, but for the most part, people seem to be able to keep the work and keep going. And, nothing has ever happened that, in my view, has escalated to that point. Now, in terms of writing a book, it has to be valuable to the reader. It's not useful to just focus on feelings and thoughts and salacious gossip and these things. There has to be some wisdom that's been validated in the thread. There has to be something productive for it to stand the test of time. Um, when I began this podcast earlier, I talked about this idea of wisdom being how one should use their time, and all these things. I've been interested in focus and time management, about the efficiency of one's use of time. Those kinds of things, those tools for life, and examples of their applications and where they provide value. I think those are important. I'm starting to become increasingly connected to the arc of history. I'm not connected to a point where I can influence it, but I am in the room or in events that actually have meaningful significance, like I've been around in the Ethiopian Civil War and all these things. But we're small players in that respect. And I often think, well, what if we weren't? What if the things we do, the things we build at some juncture or point actually start influencing and changing the arc of history? At that point, then I think that's meaningful to discuss, because there's social value in the thought process that led to the decisions that we made. So I started keeping a journal and really trying to keep it up to date and invest time in it, just in case I have to go back, because innocent decisions or observations or these things at the time could turn out to be the critical factor in something very significant. And before the critics dogpile on, say, "Oh, this is narcissism," or something like that, well, let's say that we end up building the national ID system for a country, and that ends up being the basis for e-voting, and that ends up being the basis for all e-voting in the entire world. I mean, there's not outside the realm of possibility. Cardano was just an idea in 2015. And now it's a network with millions of people worth tens of billions of dollars that's growing at a very rapid pace. If that continues, it could be worth $1 trillion and have 1 billion people in 20 years or 30 years. That could happen. Who knows? In which case, the influence that would have, the industries it would control, it could be the back end of nation states. So historians will ask, business leaders will ask, how did we get here? What was the point of that? So it is important just to write things down, just in case that does occur, in which case you can go back with some degree of objectivity, or at least the subjectivity of the moment, as opposed to the hindsight of the future. Charles, I would like to hear your thoughts on the future of smartphone software. Will we see non-proprietary OSs becoming popular? It would be good if we had a Linux of smartphone. Well, Adam, technically, Android is a Linux project. It is technically open source, which is why many people use it. But I hear you. I feel you. It doesn't feel that way when ultimately there are gatekeepers who control the experience and what can be on it. And this is the perpetual frustration of open source. And this is the perpetual frustration of centralization. If 99% of your ecosystem is open source, but 1% isn't, or it's somehow curated and controlled, and that 1% happens to be the skeleton key or the gatekeeper for how people use the other 99%, you're not actually open source. This is why I hate projects that claim to be cryptocurrencies, but then patent things, because one guy, one group of people ultimately has a legal monopoly on who gets to use it. And they act as a curator. Even if they don't choose to use that, they have the right to do so. And that really hurts Fortune 500 and government adoption. Actually, cross comparison of cryptographic algorithms, you look at Ntrue, and this lattice-based crypto compared to their open source equivalents, people always seem to pick the open source patent-free versus the patented, especially in the 2000s. So I would like to see more progress made in open ecosystem. It's bizarre that so few companies, Apple, Google, Microsoft, have such a strong say on what goes on your phone and the business models you're allowed to deploy. I can install pretty much anything I want on Windows or Linux, but then when it goes to Google phones, so Android phones, and it goes to Apple phones, it's curated at the core. Now, that curation has benefits. It has allowed mass market adoption. There are billions of users of smartphones all around the planet. Smartphones are the dominant business model, well beyond anything the PC has achieved. So it seems like that curation is socially acceptable, but it has the consequences of mass wholesale transfer of power to the few. I would like to see an open phone. There's been a lot of projects that have attempted this. There's been a lot of people trying to create diversity in the phone space. People have ported Ubuntu to the phone. There have been people to try to build varieties like Silent Circle. There are OSs, for example, Copperhead OS, these types of things that exist. And I've kind of followed along, and I know all the guys. We run into each other every few years at different cryptographic or security conferences, and they always try to tell me this is the year that people are going to pay attention and wake up. A Libre phone is an example of that. Even has little hardware switches on it that allows you to like turn off the camera and turn off the microphone and other things with a hardware disconnect, so it can't be hacked into. And unfortunately, that whole industry is just not where it needs to be. So it is what it is, and we wish the best, but that's a problem I can't solve. I'd like to, because Cardano has to run on infrastructure, and if it's running on proprietary or curated infrastructure, actually it means it's a cat and mouse game where either you allow all the features of Cardano, or whatever gets deployed on that proprietary platform has to be in some way sanitized, as we've seen with MetaMask, for example, and some of the decisions they've made recently. Now, this is an interesting one. What are your thoughts on psilocybin, and do you believe in its ability to reset the brain for the better? So psilocybin is the chemical that causes you to trip when you eat a magic mushroom. And for a long time, people just thought it was some sort of club drug in common culture, like the hippie drug. But it turns out it's been used for thousands of years by shamans and cultures for all kinds of rituals and for healing. And lately, Roland Griffiths and others have been studying it. And there's a great series of experiments at Johns Hopkins that are looking at the application of this substance for the treatment of PTSD, depression, and other maladies of the mind. And it turns out that the clinical evidence is they're more effective than the drugs that people are using. So what it does is it messes with your default mode network. And if you're really curious about this, there's a great book from Michael Pollan called How to Change Your Mind. And if you don't want to read the book, then just Google him and Joe Rogan and listen to the podcast with Michael Pollan. And that podcast really covers what he discovered by researching psychedelics. Now, interestingly enough, some of the things the Neural Meditation Institute and others are looking at is if one was using guided meditation with an EEG, could you enter into the same clearing refresh that the refresh of the default mode network is achieved via psilocybin? And the answer is yes, surprisingly. So you might not actually have to take a psychedelic to achieve the same things a psychedelic achieves. So that's an emerging area of research, and it's quite exciting. Hey, Charles, I'm a PhD student at University of Wyoming working on formalizing the elliptic curve crypto algorithms. Can I intern with IOHK this summer? Well, give me a little bit more information. Are you in the master's or the PhD program in the computer science department? And who is your supervisor? So reach out to your supervisor, have him reach out to the department chair and come to us. I'd be very interested in the formalization of elliptic curve crypto. In particular, we are looking at pairings. Um, there's a lot of different frameworks. You can write a verified implementation, and there's a language called Jasmine, which came out of India, which is really interesting and useful. There's also like Easy Crypt and these other frameworks, but I'm really interested in how exactly you're approaching the formalization, and how do you even write a specification? What elliptic curves are you looking at? Is it like the Bitcoin curve, SEC P256K1, or Twisted Edward curves, the ED25519, which is the one we use, or is it like BLS? It's an interesting topic to me. Now, I will warn you that Project Everest and other projects in industry have not really yielded great results when people try to formalize crypto. Yawa has also approached this. They even wrote a framework called Cryptal. And Cryptal was, again, an attempt to basically start talking about crypto in a more formal way. And also, how formalized do you want to be on the stack? So you can have a correct by construction high level language, but when it compiles down to bytecode, is the bytecode isomorphic to, or I guess bisimilar would be the term, to the top code? And you are using a certified compiler for that? So what is your root of trust in the formal chain when you do these things? So that's a really fascinating topic, and you might be getting yourself into an endless river where you really can't say much. If you do want to formalize something, I would, if I were you, instead of looking at particular all elliptic curve crypto, maybe it would be useful to take a look at a particular form of elliptic curve crypto. One I'm very interested in is the crypto of Jao, JAO. He's out of, I think, Waterloo or University of Toronto, one of those two. It's in Toronto. And he's doing something called super singular isogenies. Now, this is a particular class of elliptic curve crypto, and I'm very interested in it because it appears to be post-quantum. And you may be able to have your cake and eat it too. Most of the post-quantum stuff is very inefficient and has very large key sizes and signature sizes, which make them not suitable for use in cryptocurrencies. But if you could get elliptic curves at elliptic curve prices, but be post quantum, that would be super interesting. It would be really interesting to see a bridge and show that the proofs in Zhao's papers are actually compatible with the ideas that Shor had. It's a very hard problem, but it's probably PhD solvable within a 2 to 3 year time period if you have the right advisor and you do the right things. And it would be incredibly useful in evangelizing, popularizing a very exotic form of elliptic curve crypto. Building general purpose, usable, verified implementations of elliptic curve crypto. That's probably 500 to 1,000 man years of research and work that needs to be done. So that's something a team of cryptographers would spend 3 to 5 years on, maybe 10 years on. Just as an example, a verified microkernel, the SEL4 microkernel project, which was written in Haskell and Isabella, was 10 years of work. And this is, in my view, probably the equivalent amount of complexity. So reach out to your advisor and have them reach out to me. Everybody at University of Wyoming knows me, so they can easily send me an email through the comp sci department. I assume that's where you're at, because the math department doesn't do any formal methods. They don't even have a number theory program. But anyway, just have them reach out to me, and we can certainly talk offline. Lambo. Shout out to Crypto Buff. Well, I've never met him, but good to meet you, Crypto Buff, and shout out. Thanks for all the hard work. Charles, can we expect more People of IOG interviews? Love watching those. Absolutely. I'd have a lot of fun doing them, and we're going to keep doing them. I'm building out the downstairs, and we're going to put a podcast studio in, and we'll get back to that. But I'll try to get a few more interviews in. It's just been an incredibly busy time. Incredibly busy time. Oh my God, this is great. Charles, is there a place in Cardano for music makers? So I was up at my ranch this weekend. And yes, I did have some time to enjoy driving around and showing everybody there, but 34 people were at the ranch. Some came in as far as Paris to be there to talk about crypto bison, and in particular, non-deterministic, algorithmically generated music that is built for tripartite PvP with an audience. Ooh. So basically, the idea is, imagine a card game is connected to a music generator. You put them together, and you can generate music and have a PvP mechanic. How about that? That's what we were talking about, the core of that, the technology of that. And we have some really cool ideas, and we've built some amazing gameplay mechanics, and we have several companies we're working with to do that. So not only is there a place for music makers, I think Cardano is going to be one of the first places to do everything from NFTs and IP to microtransactions to band offs, kind of like rap battles, but for music, and all kinds of other cool things. So this will really inspire a lot of people. So I can't say too much more about it, but I will tweet at some point. I asked Tim to do this, a video of a song we built together using just dice and cards, and then inputting that into a system. All of those will be digitized in the final product. But yeah, there's definitely a place for it. I think it's going to be great for mass adoption and just really interesting for musicians. Charles, why, if you're a huge proponent of FOSS, do you use an OS like Windows? I do. I use Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, and iPad OS and Android. I use all the operating systems. I'm not one or the other. I do use Linux extensively, especially things like Cubes OS and Ubuntu are two. For high security applications, I use Cubes, and for general purpose stuff, I use Linux. I'm going to start doing a lot of stuff in data science the second part of this year, and I'm probably going to do all the programming of that in on Ubuntu. I used to use Linux extensively because I used to do a lot of work with Sage, and Sage has a Python-like syntax, and Sage works best on Linux, and LaTeX also works best on Linux. So all that work involved that. But you develop habits, and there are certain things Windows is just really easy with. But lately, Windows has not really been as compelling as it used to be back in the XP days and so forth. And you can do everything you want on Linux. And I find myself using tablet OSs like Android OS and iOS far more than I'm actually using the desktop stuff outside of the getting productivity, getting stuff done. Hmm. Favorite cigar, the Arturo Fluente Hemingway. Actually, for that PhD student, let's give him. All right, let's see here. Go. Here we go. Yeah, 122 citations. Yeah, here we go. So I'm gonna. So if you go to this link here, you'll see the paper. Sorry, I have to type it all in, but the title is a post-quantum digital signature scheme based on supersingular isogenies. This work from David Zhao and the other authors is really interesting stuff. I think Zhao's Waterloo. Let me double check where his affiliation's at. Yeah, he's Waterloo. He's math department, so he's probably elliptic curve guy. Yeah, he went to Harvard. Okay, so yeah, I'd recommend that paper. And boy, if you could formalize that, that'd be a lot of fun. That's probably 3 years worth of work, but you get to work with some pretty cool people, and you learn an enormous amount about not just formalization of elliptic curves, but something unique and sexy. Have you read Changing the World Order by Ray Dalio? You know, he's a bit pro China for me, but I will read it. People keep throwing it at me. Have you read the book Principles? I saw the interview. I think it was a Lex Friedman podcast, and I downloaded it, but I didn't have time to read it. It's my queue. I have a queue more than 60 books long to read, and I'm like, ah, I wish there was more time. This is why I'm so interested in accelerated learning, because I'd like to be able to read like 5 books a week, but I can only read one, and people give me more books than I have time for. Thanks for your answer, Charles. It's also frustrating that such powerful hardware like the new M1 chip PCs will be so hard to get open sourced OSs due to the proprietary politics of Apple. Adam, that's actually a huge concern. There was a lot of value with the Wintel monopoly in that the separation of the hardware maker from the software maker meant that the hardware maker's incentive was to get the hardware to work on as many platforms as possible to maximize sales. The vertical integration of this means that the hardware should only work on one OS. That's really tricky, and that's bad. And actually, I hadn't thought of it until you mentioned it, but yeah, that's a huge problem. A lot of MacBooks run Linux operating systems, and if the M1 doesn't play nice, that's going to be super hard. And we could run into some sort of weird ass black room and black box engineering of drivers and things like that. It's not even clear to me how you would do that with the M1. The problem with the M1, for those of you who don't know, is it's everything together. So normally a CPU, a GPU, memory controller, memory, and other logic, they tend to be separated. And then over time, what's happened is more things have gotten into the CPU. So they put the memory controller into the CPU instead of having a North bridge. And then they said, oh, well, let's start putting some ASICs in that do image processing and so forth. And then AMD had AMD Fusion. They said, let's put the GPU into the chip. What M1's done is they've taken all of that and said, we want that, but we'll put Wi-Fi in and Bluetooth in, but we're also going to put in the memory into the chip package as well. So the M1 has everything all in one chip, and it's super damn efficient, and it's just crazy fast, and it's super smart, the Apple Silicon, and they're actually gaining instead of slowing down in their lead, and it's very energy efficient. Copy the big little core architecture that Qualcomm and others have made so popular. I guess ARM in general made popular, where you have different processing cores. Some are lower efficiency and do less, but they use considerably less power. So that's the little, and some are for high performance tasks, and you have sets of them. So it's a great chip, but proprietary, and that's a problem for the industry. Any WASM coming to the stacks? We're looking into it. It's a good ocean strategy. We are definitely looking into it. There's been a lot of movement in that direction. Is there any possibility language like Reach will come to Cardano? It's chain agnostic, high level language. I did a bit of work with it on Algorand. It looks really promising. Yeah, these types of things are definitely in the realm of possibility. You can always write a compiler from one to another system. Um, we use slightly different accounting models, but I do think it's possible. And I think there may even be a Cardano project for that. I'd have to look into it. Charles, is that fireplace electric? It is electric. Hey, Charles, was there already the hard fork or update for February? Yes, it was already done. It wasn't a hard fork, it was just a major update. It was almost the size of a hard fork, but no ledger rules were changed, so we didn't have to do that. Thank you for asking, Eli. How are you doing today, sir? I am incredibly tired, a bit worn down, and frankly, a little disappointed, but I'm okay. Favorite MCU character? Iron Man, Doctor Strange. Charles, do you know any good literary agents? Yes, I do. I assume that's your question to ask if I need an agent, and I assume you probably are an agent. Favorite type of weapon or gun? Well, you have to do that by category. I do like pistols, and it's really hard to argue with just the simplicity and efficiency of the Glock 19. Nothing is more controversial than guns, by the way. And for shotguns, I like the M4, the Benelli M4, and then for rifles, really, really like the Scar 17S. But that's my choice. Everybody has their own preferences. It just really depends on the situations you're in, the preferences you have. But that's a good spectrum. You'll probably have a good experience regardless of what you're trying to do, whether it be trap shooting or home defense. I'll just get an what is that, model 1873 or something like that. Carry it around my ranch. I do have Longmire's coat. It's the coat right behind me. I was the sucker at Overland who bought it. Hi, Charles. I'm looking to leave law enforcement. Do you need a bodyguard, a holder, if that helps? Well, Mike, we're hiring, actually. I do have a security detail. Times have become very dangerous. And we have hired some people in law enforcement. We hire a lot of military as well. If you look at our website, you can probably find the open jobs posted. You're welcome to apply. Best of luck. See, you're hard at work. Yes, communicating with the people in the Cardano ecosystem is one of my jobs. How did you learn to fly your Blackberry? I don't fly it. I have 2 pilots, actually 3 pilots. One's right now seconded, and he's fighting in a war. The other 2 are out of the military, and they fly it. One of these days, I'll learn how to do that, but it takes about a year to 2 years, and year full time, 2 years, 3 years if you're doing it part time. And I'm really not in a position to spare large quantities of time. But it's a lovely aircraft. I really do enjoy it. You can do things with the Blackhawk that's pretty crazy, like this 0G ascent goes up a bit and then drops down, and people float. The maneuverability is incredible. Got it because I'm a rancher and I needed something that could transport a large group of people, but also something that could be used for firefighting. At my ranch last year, there were 6 major fires in the area, and they're quite difficult to fight. Blackhawk, especially if you upgrade it with a Lima engine, it has enough lifting capacity to really do damage on fire. And if you have great pilots, they really enjoy these really dangerous missions. You get a normal helicopter pilot and you say, go fly into that fire and dump some water on it. They're like, I don't know, man. I need some hazard pay for that. You get a Blackhawk pilot and they're like, yeah, that's great. Let's go do that. Let's have some fun. But I do love it. Having a hell of a time with the FAA, though. It's in a restricted category, so we're still trying to figure out what to do there. Charles, big fan. Want to start coding, but I don't know where to start. Do you have any suggestions? In terms of languages, I thought a lot about this. Python is probably the best beginner and high utility language. Probably a close second is JavaScript. But Python, I think, is a better pedagogical entry point because there's so many textbooks, so many courses, and there's great stuff on Udemy, great stuff on Code School, great stuff like Learn Python the Hard Way. Thousands of curriculums out there. You'll never be disappointed. There's even a course from MIT on introduction to computer science, and it's taught in Python. And there's just so much free pedagogy there, and you can do everything in it. It's a really good starting point for coding. And then if you want to learn computer science, it's a good entry point to move in that direction. There used to be more debate, but I think it is kind of the universal language to start with. And that's coming from a guy who likes functional programming. Like, it used to be like Lisp, structure of interpretation of computer programs. There you go. Sadly, no. JavaScript is a lot better than it used to be too. It was a prototypical inheritance, language, and didn't have classes or anything. And so the object-oriented paradigm was a little wonky. But now JavaScript 6, ECMAScript 6, it has everything. So, yeah, heart's content. Charles, will you use Starlink for your ranch? No, What I did is I blasted out a 1.5 mile road up to a mountaintop. I built a 30-foot microwave tower and trenched out a fiber optic cable from the tower down to the ranch structures. So I get gigabit internet at the ranch. Took 5 months. Got to use dynamite. Why don't you just install sprinklers? That's probably less expensive than a Blackhawk. Well, you can certainly put sprinklers on your structures. It may do something, but part of the reason you buy a ranch is because you enjoy having beautiful forests. And if they all burn down, then you have just charred down trees. Think about that, sir. Is the bison meat all grass fed? Yep. They graze all year. Does this guy say put sprinklers on 1,000 acres? It's not 1,000, it's 11,000. It's too big. You put them on the structures too. Patrick Moore asks, when will JavaScript developers be able to start working with Plutus? I wouldn't recommend it. What I'd recommend is if you're a JavaScript developer, learn Solidity and then build on Mamba, the Ethereum sidechain. It's a much easier port. Plutus is really for those who want to invest time to write high assurance applications or high performance main chain applications. All right, let's do one more, then I'm going to go home. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, since I didn't get any good questions, do you ever contribute to Sea Boulder? I did make a rather large donation to them, but that's for a different time, honoring an old friend of mine. All right, everybody. Had a lot of fun, enjoyed, from time to time do AMA. Sorry, I only have an hour, but I have an engagement I have to get to. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day. There's going to be a lot of fun things in the coming months. Going to Consensus, more likely than not. That'll be June 9th to 12th. Mark that on your calendars. I will be there, and likely a large chunk of my team will be, alongside many others. And we'll make an announcement at a later date about the nature of that. Stay tuned for Cardano 360. Lot to say. Huge amount of progress on many different things. But, there's always more time to tell you later.